It is 2018 and the centenary of the end of the Great War. My name is Hayler-King, and I am a filmmaker who has always had a fascination with history and how history is presented in the media. 100 years on, the Great War still exerts an enduring fascination. Over the decades, there have been many different films, television shows, and other productions focusing on the First World War. I hope to eventually produce my own film to add to the ever-expanding catalogue that focuses on this period in history. We've all heard about the war in the trenches, and many people have relatives who fought in the First World War, and I'm certainly not the only person who has an interest in this part of history.
Hello, I'm currently in a field in Kent. It's the middle of January, it's snowing and I'm covered in mud. And I'm currently in the middle of a World War I recreation trench, and we're going to see how it's being built and the people who are building it.
I'm meeting up with a group of historians, archaeologists and enthusiasts who are in the process of building a full-scale recreation of a First World War trench. Historian and author Dr Dale Clarke explained to me what the team is trying to achieve.
What we're doing here is recreating a trench effectively as a piece of experimental archaeology. It enables us to look much harder at the source material because we find ourselves asking questions. We all think we know about the trenches, but actually there's an awful lot of mythology, cherished narrative, and by actually building a trench, we find that we're getting much deeper understanding of what actually went on and what people were trying to achieve. You find that descriptions in books often gloss over techniques, or things were just assumed or they were passed on by word of mouth. A lot of science went into building trenches. People were constantly evolving techniques, recording best practice, and basically trying to win, trying to save their lives and trying to gain an advantage over the other side.
The project is led by military historian Andy Robertshaw. It was Andy's idea to recreate the trench in the first place.
When I was working at the Army Museum in Chelsea, there was an idea that we might build a replica trench inside the museum. And every time it was discussed, people wanted to add in features such as a trench raid or gas or a big battle. And I always said that wasn't the experience of trench warfare. The experience of trench warfare was day-to-day, eating, sleeping, drinking in a hole in the ground. When I worked on Warhorse, when it was all over, the prop department gave me most of the trench system. And I decided that what I would do was to build a trench system to write a book about it, to use it as a set for the photographs. The curious thing was that as soon as I'd done that, school said, could they come and have a look round? And although this is the third time we've done it, we are once again about to be overwhelmed by people who want to experience trench warfare. Not from the point of view of going over the top or being shot at, but actually just the nuts and bolts, eating, sleeping, drinking, living in a hole in the ground.
The trench the team are building is based on historical research and archaeology, and the idea is to make not a film set, but something that is as close as possible to a real trench from the Western Front. As someone who is a stickler for accuracy, or as close to accuracy in the historical films I enjoy, I can certainly appreciate this need to recreate realism.
This trench system is inspired by the trenches in the British lines at Marlborough Street, facing Hawthorne Crater. Very importantly, the geology there is chalk, identical to the chalk here, and I'm also involved in archaeology at Hawthorne, so I'm actually informing what we're doing here by the archaeology in France. When we're building a trench like this one, you're thinking about two things. One is to make it as authentic as you can. The other one is, frankly, modern health and safety. We need to make sure that nobody's going to snag themselves on barbed wire. And we were saying just earlier on that really the trench boards on a wet day like today, we need to put chicken wire down. There's nothing wrong with that. They did it, but actually we're thinking about it from the point of view of modern health and safety. Because the curious thing about the chicken wire is, and this is when this is experimentally archaeology, it sounds brilliant. Actually, for the studied boots of the day, what the chicken wire does is it hooks over the studs and pulls them out. This is a way of understanding the experience of the Great War. The little bits and pieces nobody ever spoke about. Nobody ever interviewed a veteran of the Great War and said, oh, how did you get on with the chicken wire on the trench boards? When we're doing our archaeology, We don't just go straight in. We'll do the desk-based study first. What you do is you look at all the printed sources. And of course, for the First World War, you've got the memoirs, you've got film on our location at Hawthorne. It's the mine that was filmed being blown on the 1st of July by Geoffrey Malins. But we've got aerial photographs, we've got trench maps. And of course, what we're also doing, because the actual craters are in the German lines, we're looking at the German sources. And the great thing about that is all the Bavarian archives survive.
The team talk a lot about experimental archaeology, and I wanted to find out what that term really meant. After some discussion, Andy went on to explain.
And I find experimental archaeology important because it informs you about just the little things about trenches. I mean, in one system of trenches, we actually found brick lining. When we found it, we actually discovered that there was a layer of clay on top, still there, and then above that, a layer of crushed slate, which made no sense that we could work out, until I discovered in a war diary mentions of the fact that the stretcher bearers were coming in with their boots around their necks on their bootlaces because they were finding that the brick-lined trenches, once they got muddy, were so slippery they couldn't carry the patients. So I think what we found was basically 1915 health and safety. Someone had said, this is dangerous, cover those bricks with a layer of crushed slate. And you wouldn't have known that unless you'd done the archaeology. Well, what we've done here is built in microsm a section of trench from the front line back to the reserve line, and we're putting in a tramway. We're already in a dugout. We have infantry shelters. We're about to build a latrine. All the bits that would make the trench system work and get an understanding of how everything works, how it all relates, from the medical post to how the supplies come in and out and how the wounded leave. Because curiously, although people write books and obviously make films, they never feature life in a trench.
While talking to the team working on this trench, I've quickly come to realise that they have a huge respect for the men and women who served in the First World War. To the Hawthorne Trench team, the soldiers of the Great War are very real people, and people the team respect and want to show their respect to, rather than pity.
We build images which are part of how we understand ourselves, how we understand our society, and how we understand history. If we think about the First World War, the cherished narrative is one nowadays of pity, of waste. Things like the war will be over by Christmas, we all laugh at that. But actually it was true, it nearly was over by 1915. When you think the war actually only lasted 4 years, it's a fraction of the time that we spent in Afghanistan recently.
After a long and very cold day working on the trench, the team downed tools and stopped for a well-earned cup of tea. We were all frozen and very tired, but there is a real atmosphere of underlying cheer, camaraderie and respect.
Those famous battles that we talk about when we think about the First World War, Ypres or Verdun or the Somme, they're all fought on Belgian or French soil because the Germans had invaded. Britain had a choice of accepting a greater Germany that now occupied chunks of France and Belgium, or joining in that fight. So it was not just some random thing involving vague archdukes. There was a real point to this, that geopolitically, what was going to happen? Were we just going to accept a German invasion? And the answer was no. When we're working in these conditions, we build up a respect for these people. They were very professional. Bear in mind, they weren't professional soldiers. They were people who, for the most part, had been volunteered or conscripted. They'd never intended to be soldiers, most of them, but they became very good at it very quickly. At every stage, people were trying to learn lessons. They were doing the best they possibly could in impossible conditions. And by taking people and putting them in these trenches, you can show the amount of expertise, the amount of skill, the amount of sheer effort that went into creating the trenchscape. They weren't fools. It's astounding what they did achieve.
Seeing the small section of trench being built, I have to agree. It really is astounding to get even the smallest glimpse of something much larger than I could possibly imagine. I look forward to coming back later on in the year to see the progress the team have made, and to start putting into motion the plans to make my own trench-based film. I will be filming further progress on Hawthorne Trench in the coming weeks, as well as interviewing the other members of the team of how and why they got involved in this project. Until then, the team will continue to keep digging.